Hi everyone. So today we're going to learn a little bit about anaerobic respiration. I believe that you have already completed the muscle fatigue lab, but if you have not, before you watch this video, make sure that you do that lab. And then the teacher is also going to show you a video on someone named Dean Karnazes, who is known as the Ultra Marathon Man. And as you watch this video, I want you to think about what will happen to him after he runs for 12 straight hours. What do you think he might feel after he runs? And then you'll watch the video. Once all that's done, you can come back here. So today's lesson is going to be pretty short, but this is about anaerobic respiration. So if you remember, the root word aero means oxygen, and the root word a or an means without. So anaerobic respiration is going to be how organisms make ATP without oxygen. So if you remember the 3 steps that we just learned the past few days, those were all part of aerobic respiration. The oxygen is waiting at the end of the electron transport chain to pick up those electrons. And that type of respiration cannot happen without oxygen waiting there to pick up those electrons. So remember, we get a lot of ATP in the electron transport chain. So that's going to be affected when we don't have oxygen, and that's when organisms have to go into anaerobic respiration. So remember what the purpose is of cellular respiration. Think for a second. If you guess to break down glucose into smaller chunks of energy like ATP, then you're right. But anaerobic respiration happens when oxygen levels are really low. So remember that cellular respiration is different than breathing respiration. So you can have low oxygen levels even if the rest of your cells have oxygen, but maybe let's say you're working out like the ultra marathon man. He's using his leg muscles a lot to run. And so those leg muscles are using a lot of ATP to give those cells energy to contract as the muscles. It need oxygen most of the time. So if his oxygen levels are running low, that's probably due to the fact that he's making a lot of ATP and doing a lot of cellular respiration. So when the oxygen gets too low in those cells, that's when you convert over to anaerobic respiration. So maybe you've heard of people doing anaerobic exercise. This is just exercise where you push yourself to the point that your cells need to then function without oxygen. So what happens? Essentially, the cells are going to produce ATP using glycolysis only, and then they're going to kind of stop and move on to one final step. So if you remember from our first day, glycolysis is actually an anaerobic process. Glycolysis, the first step, doesn't require any oxygen to happen. So here's what ends up happening. Normally in glycolysis, when glucose breaks down into 2 pyruvates, 2 ATPs, and 2 NADAs, those pyruvates will then move on to the Krebs cycle. But if there's no oxygen available, the Krebs cycle will not happen. If you remember from the earlier lesson, I said the rest of cellular respiration is kind of like a domino effect. So once you get to the Krebs cycle, if you've started, you are going to finish. And if you're going to finish, the oxygen needs to be present in the ETC to pick up those electrons that get dropped off by the NADAs and the FADA2s. So if you don't have any oxygen, the cycle will not continue. And so in that case, you're going to move on to one of 2 forms of anaerobic respiration. So some organisms do what's known as alcohol fermentation, where they end up creating a type of alcohol. And this is actually how a lot of alcohol is made. So like yeast, for example, can go through alcohol fermentation, and that's how we get beer. Grapes can go through fermentation, and that's how we get wine. The other option, which is done by some bacteria and lots of mammals, is lactic acid fermentation. And in this case, the main product is lactic acid. So sadly, we cannot produce our own alcohol. We produce lactic acid, which is something they think contributes to muscle soreness. So that is usually our main byproduct. Here's another picture kind of showing the 2 possible options. So with glucose, we're going to start with glycolysis, and that gets us 2 ATP no matter what. If we have oxygen, that pyruvate is going to move on to becoming acetyl-CoA in the intermediate reactions, and then that acetyl-CoA is going to get broken down into citric acid through the citric acid cycle, which gives us a couple more ATP, and then the NADA and FADA2 are going to get moved on to the ETC, which gives us around 32 to 34 ATP. So notice with oxygen, we get 2, 4, about 36 to 38 ATP. But without oxygen, instead of going through this whole process, that pyruvate is then going to go into fermentation, and we're only going to make either lactic acid or alcohol, depending on the organism, and that's only going to yield us 2 ATP. So it's much less efficient, but at least you're still getting a little bit of energy for the bang you're putting into your buck. Here's another picture, again, showing without oxygen. Again, glucose will be converted to pyruvate. We get a little bit of ATP from that, but if oxygen is not present, we're going to do fermentation. If it is present, we'll move on into the mitochondria with the intermediate reactions forming acetyl-CoA, going into the Krebs cycle, and then eventually the ETC. So to review, when does anaerobic respiration occur in cells? If you guessed when there's no oxygen available, you're right. Think about what 2 products could be produced by anaerobic respiration. And if you need help with this, think of the 2 titles or types of anaerobic respiration. Exactly. It could either be lactic acid produced in lactic acid fermentation, or it could be alcohol produced in alcohol fermentation. And how much ATP is produced when you go through anaerobic respiration? If you guessed 2, you're correct. So it's much smaller than aerobic respiration. So now that you've finished this lesson, you can go ahead and head over to the POGIL. And the extension questions on the POGIL this time are actually about anaerobic respiration. So that's number 23 to 26. Number 25 and 26 do require you to do a little bit of outside research, so feel free to do a quick little Google search and see what you find out. I'm excited to see what you find out about fermentation, and I hope you enjoyed today's lesson and thought it was a little bit fun.